So, a couple people didn't quite catch the gist of, or may even have been harmed by the quick little conversation that we had about the Lotus Sutra. So I will briefly elaborate. Fear not, to be brief. Yes, it's true that non-Mahayana sutras don't posit the idea of everyone having the Buddha potential, or eventually everybody becoming Buddha. And they do sometimes talk about there is this tradition in non-Mahayana systems that there are some categories of beings who will never attain any sort of enlightenment. And not everybody agreed. It was one of those many things that people then argued about in India. Not everybody agreed with that. And some Mahayana sutras, I don't know how many, but there are some Mahayana sutras that teach about people having different kinds of lineages. And the Lotus Sutra is taken by, as far as I know, all types of Mahayana Buddhism today as superseding those and placing those in the category of needing to be interpreted on that point, when it teaches that we all have the Buddha nature, and that for each of us there is some time in which we will in the future attain to Buddhahood, so it's not just theoretical. And it has a very, there's a nice, let's say, if I may, parable in the sutra about this. If you didn't know, maybe because people didn't seem to know what we were talking about, then maybe I assume we didn't hear the story. So it's a nice story that there are 3 children trapped in a burning house, and the father is outside, and for some reason doesn't run in the house and get them, but instead calls to them. And tries to, and maybe apparently these children, like us, don't realize the danger they're in, and so the father is attempting to induce them to come out of the house by skillfully promising each one something that particular child will find appealing and attractive, and will lead them to come out of the house. And so to the youngest child, he promises a dog cart, that is a cart that's small enough to be pulled by a dog and that a small child could ride in, and to the middle one a goat cart, because he's bigger, and to the oldest then an ox cart, which of course these oxen are very large, and this would be a magnificent cart. And the children then are all enticed and feel, to come out, because none are afraid, and all are being offered something they want. And whereas if the father had unskillfully said, hey, I've got 3 oxen carts out here, then the 2 littler children would have been afraid, because the oxen are so big. If you see, if you're very little and you see an ox, then it doesn't seem like quite the thing. And so the idea of the dog cart and the goat cart would seem more plausible and enticing to them, and not creating fear. So, but then when they all come out of the house, it turns out they're all going to get the ox cart, and they'll all grow up, and they'll all have the very best kind of cart that one can have. That's the pair. You can see it's a self-explanatory in a certain sense. Obviously, burning house is samsara, the father is Buddha, we're the children, and we have different degrees of spiritual maturity, right? And the father is a skillful teacher and is able to adapt the teaching so as to lead each person to their highest potential, and to not frighten away some from, and leave them in the burning house because they're afraid of something that will ultimately be for their benefit. So this is like a great thing about that little story is that it has a lot of things involved in it. One is, okay, now this tells you that all these other scriptures may have said that some of us have the lineage to be hearers, and some of us have the lineage to be solitary realizers, and some of us have a lineage to be Buddhas, and maybe some of us don't have any of those lineages, but that requires interpretation in the context of this story to understand that, well, those things may have been taught, but they were taught skillfully, compassionately for a purpose, so as to lead everybody in the right direction, and in the end, everyone will get the Mahayana, that is, the big ox cart, carries infinite number of beings to enlightenment, right? So I guess if you're doing it, then you would have a moped and something like that, so, like go-kart or something, and then we would have an SUV, or I don't know what it is that the kids want. So I do I do the really big bus, right, when I'm explaining Mahayana, to put everybody in there. And even if it takes a longer time to get there, we're not going to worry about it. But then if we have the tantric supercharging, on the engine, then maybe it will go faster. But that's not the point. The point is to have the vehicle be big enough to get everybody included. Anyway, so you've got several things in there. It tells you how to interpret the other teachings, and it gives you this idea of skill and means of the teacher, and that everything can't be taken literally, but it has a kind of truth behind it and is leading you towards your greatest welfare. And then also this idea that everyone fundamentally has this the Buddha nature or the Buddha potential. What exactly that Buddha nature is then becomes subject to many, many, many additional sutras, shastras, and subsequent debates down to today in Buddhism. Okay, so that was just in response to a comment. I said I would start today by going back and looking at a couple of the things that were brought up before. Okay. Briefly, one of those was, so I'll do a couple things out of the great treatise. That first a little bit about no thought, and then a little bit about the compatibility of dependent arising and emptiness. And then when we get through those, then I'll come back to what else I have to say, which doesn't necessarily push the conversation farther, but just puts everything I know out on the table about this issue of what it means for things to be conceptually designated. So in third volume of the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path of Enlightenment, I mentioned before that this is a huge issue for Tsongkhapa, that you have to analyze and you have to use conceptual thought. We're going to see when we look at Sautronica next, and after Vaibhashika, that a big contribution of that system is this idea that you use conceptual thought to understand to understand selflessness, to understand emptiness. That there's not like an idea that Sautronica makes it clear that the conceptual thought is a necessary and essential part of the practice of the path. That, for example, direct perception has the impermanence of the table appearing to it as an aspect along with all the other characteristics of the table, but that we don't notice it. And so it doesn't help us. And you have to stop and analyze and think about your experience in order to start to understand this idea that things are changing instant by instant. It's not a matter of just watching the table really closely. And because it's always appearing, but it's so subtle that it's like not observable, but it can be understood upon analysis and reflection. So Sautronica, as it's explained in the Gelugpa system introduces to people as they're going along, among other things, this idea that conceptual thought plays a valuable role in the path and is not the enemy per se, although ultimately you'll transcend it. And I just had a couple short passages from 334 to 335 in Volume 3. Tsongkhapa cites the play of Manjushri Sutra, which I haven't looked up this quote, but it's interesting because Manjushri is in dialogue with a woman and says, "Daughter, how are bodhisattvas victorious in battle? Manjushri, when they analyze, they do not observe any phenomena." Now you know why Tsongkhapa is quoting that, because she doesn't just say they don't observe any phenomena, which would have, you'd find in many, but it says specifically when they analyze, they don't observe any phenomena. So Tsongkhapa comments, "Thus yogis open the eye of wisdom and defeat the enemy of the afflictions, with the weapon of wisdom. They're fearless, like as it says in the Heart Sutra, right? They do not shut their eyes like cowards." So it's getting a little pointed language here. He's like implying that other Buddhist systems where people just make their minds blank so they'll get a break from the afflictions are chicken. That's basically what he's saying. They can't take it, right? Therefore, and he takes an example of, guess what, the rope and the snake. When you're frightened upon mistaking a rope for a snake, you're frightened of the snake, you stop suffering of fear by developing certain knowledge that this coiled thing is a rope rather than a snake. In other words, you have to analyze and think about the characteristics of what you're observing and reflect upon it, and you have this wrong thought that there's a snake there, and that's the basis of your fear, and you have to use the evidence of your senses, maybe moving your head around to get some additional data, and then reflect and analyze on what you're experiencing to try to reach certain knowledge or a definite conviction that's arising conceptually from that analysis that that's actually a rope. That's how you get rid of your fear. It's not by going like, this is what he's doing. It's not like that, okay? I think he has a lot of humor in this book, actually. You just have to likewise, we're all mistaken in thinking that the two selves exist. And this mistake creates all the suffering of cyclic existence. But decisive scripture and reasoning will bring certainty that the object of the conception of the self, that is, what we're thinking about when we cling on to the idea of the self, doesn't exist at all. And you'll realize that that idea of a self is a mistake. And when you get accustomed to that fact, you'll overcome and eliminate that misconception. And when you utterly stop that misconception, you'll stop cyclic existence. And this is the reason that there's so many collections of arguments in Madhyamaka. So that's where I wanted to stop. But he's saying, in other words, if analysis weren't necessary, why do you have the Karikas? Why do you have Nagarjuna giving, all these arguments? He could just give people, some kind of recipe for setting their mind in non-conceptuality without having to go to all that trouble. Yeah. Okay. So, I don't know, it may seem like we're beating a dead horse there, but that's like probably one of the most important themes of Ramon Chemo. Okay, so let's see, dependent arising part. That was my place. Okay, here we go. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about this because this is my interpretation of the question, maybe. But it said over and over again, and we're chanting various things that emphasize the synonymity of, you could say, I guess, the dependent arising and emptiness. And it is absolutely crucial and important, and it's repeated over and over again. And it's like it's a fundamental idea from the 24th chapter of Nagarjuna's A Treatise on the Middle Way, and then it's repeated over and over again in Tsongkhapa's, first book here, first mature book, 1401, great treatise on the stages of the path, because he thinks that, as Venerable Chodron was arguing the other day, that if you think that dependent arising means that for something to work as a cause for something else, it has to have an intrinsic nature. Otherwise, if it didn't have something real about it, how could it work or operate as a cause? Then this leads to two conclusions. One is things can't be empty. Dependent arising means that things aren't empty, because if they were empty, then they couldn't function as causes. They wouldn't have this nature. So things aren't empty. Dependent arising works. Or you go the other way and you say, well, things are really definitely empty, and since that proves that there is no dependent arising. See what I'm saying? The nihilists and both extremes hold the same assumption. Tsongkhapa makes a big deal out of that, because the reason is because most of the people he's really upset with at this point, he considers to be Tibetan nihilist misreaders of Chandrakirti. And he's saying these people, think that Chandrakirti is, has no position whatsoever, or his position is that, dependent arising is unsustainable under analysis, is refuted by analysis, that there isn't any such thing as dependent arising, because we can't hold any position at all, because nothing exists, when you understand what emptiness really means. And he's saying they have, by doing that, he's trying, he ridicules them, you could say, by saying, well, you think that you have a very, very profound understanding of Chandrakirti, but in fact you have exactly the same assumption that the Buddhist realists did when Nagarjuna was refuting them back in several, what was that, 13 centuries before in India, when people were saying, that the Four Noble Truths won't work if you keep saying everything is empty. What's the common assumption? Existence is intrinsic existence. And, for things to work, they have to have a fixed essential nature. So if you assume that, then you either go to one extreme and saying, yeah, we have dependent arising, but we can't stand that emptiness thing. That was what they were doing in India with the good people Nagarjuna was refuting, the Vaibhashikas and so forth. Or you go to the other extreme, the Tibetan people who are reading Chandrakirti and interpreting it in kind of a nihilistic way, and they said, well, absolutely, we can't separate existence from intrinsic existence. Nagarjuna was intending to refute existence. Conventions exist as sort of a compassionate concession to stupid people who haven't become enlightened, and we wouldn't really think of holding that there's such thing as a, valid distinction between right and wrong, because that would be grossly dualistic. But merely just as a concession to unenlightened people, we can talk like that to help them. You think that I'm making this up, but no, this is how the books they actually say like that. Yeah. So Tsongkhapa, of course, is saying, look, you think that you have the profound meaning, the deep reading of Chandrakirti, and you think that I'm going over to a realist extreme, but look at it. You have the exact same common assumption that the realists do, and that is existence equals intrinsic existence. The only difference is, having made that assumption, they're going to go with existence and inherent existence, yay, and you're going to go with existence and inherent existence, nay. And what neither one of you has done is like, hey, can't we say existence not only doesn't require inherent nature, but is only possible without it. And that's what he takes exactly as the point of all of these wisdom texts. Yeah. Okay, so that being the case, there's a huge emphasis on the meaning of dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness. A huge emphasis, and it's even said sometimes dependent arising is emptiness. Emptiness is dependent arising. Okay, so I want to read a little bit about that, and then think about what's being said and what's not being said. So this is on page 130. I'm starting at the top, page 137 in the third volume of the Great Treatise. where J. Rinpoche is quoting Nagarjuna's refutation of objections. And he says, we say that the dependent arising of things is called emptiness. So, it sounds like if you just take that, and that's the only thing, he would just say, there's a dependent arising of things, that's the basis of imputation, and emptiness is the object of imputed, and that's it. Then the second part of the verse is, that which arises dependently has no intrinsic nature. So it's clear that that's what he means by emptiness, is an utter lack of intrinsic nature. And I don't know, depending on how you take it, you could take that as a gloss on the first part and saying, well, what we mean when we say that dependent arising is called emptiness is we mean that things that are arising dependently are utterly empty. Okay, now not everybody would take it that way, but that's the way Tsongkhapa takes it. And he makes that clear by just skipping down over a whole bunch of commentary. He comes down and he says, what Nagarjuna means is that whatever relies on causes and conditions lacks intrinsic nature. And that whatever has intrinsic nature does not rely on causes and conditions. That's his explanation. What did Nagarjuna say? He says, dependent arising is what we call emptiness. So he doesn't say, he said dependent arising and emptiness, and therefore they're always exactly the same, they're always exactly, literally, precisely the same thing. He interprets as meaning whatever thing you can point to that is a dependent arising, that thing also is a thing that is empty of intrinsic nature. That's different from saying that thing is emptiness. Because if we see a dependent arising, have we realized empty? We directly perceive an object that is a dependent arising. That's an instance of dependent arising. Have we directly perceived emptiness? And then the problem is, again, if we had, then we would already be completely enlightened several times over, if that were possible. So that's why he doesn't spell that out, but it's like, that seems to be, he doesn't break it down. He just says, it's obvious. But, in the way he explains what Nagarjuna says, he's made a little refinement, right? It's not, he wants you to understand absolutely that these things, that it is the keystone of his refutation of Tibetan nihilism, that these two things have the same import. So he's on it all the time. But he's not going so far as to say, when I'm quoting these texts that say that, I want you to understand that these are absolutely a chikpa, as we say, one and the same precise thing. They're two ways of talking about or thinking about or identifying. It's a rabbit duck situation, right, where there's two ways of seeing or identifying or looking at the same set of objects or phenomena. Okay. So, So then he goes on to say, if you think that for there to be dependent arising, then there would have to be some essential existence. And then you use the arguments against intrinsic existence to refute dependent arising, then all those Madhyamaka arguments against intrinsic nature said this is like turning a god into a demon. It's like and he doesn't name names, but he's talking about other Tibetans who are relying on Chandrakirti and interpreting them, not every single one, but by and large, in what he considers to be a very nihilistic way. He's saying, you were the ones who were taking the godlike arguments of Nagarjuna that refute intrinsic nature and make that refutation very explicitly in the text. If you read Refutation of Objections, like the passage I just cited for you, or if you read 2418 in the Treatise on the Middle Way, he tells you that the emptiness and dependent arising have the same meaning. And yet you still go around, using these arguments in a way that refutes dependent arising, right? So that's what he's saying. You're making a god into a demon, and that means you'll never really understand the Madhyamaka view. And so, when you develop a sense of certainty that phenomena lack even a particle of intrinsic nature, then there won't be any basis for you to have a conviction about the relationship between your actions and their effects within your own system. So, in other words, that your philosophy will allow no place for that. But since you're going to be a Dharma teacher, and you're still going to have to guide people, but you have a philosophy that doesn't have any basis, what we would call in the West any meta-ethics. It doesn't have any basis from which to speak about the difference between right and wrong, because everything being empty cancels out all conventional distinctions. So what are you going to do? Well, it is the fact that these teachers do not just simply, oh, go do whatever you want, everything's empty. They don't say that. They do, provide ethical instruction, but as he says, you have to posit these as others see them. That is, you say, well, for fools, we'll give you these rules. We'll give you, this idea, try not to kill, and so forth. But ultimately, from the point of view of wisdom, we understand that there is no killing, right? But it would be helpful for you in the process of getting to the stage where you could understand that there is no killing, to, for the time being, undertake a commitment not to kill, right? And that seems to what he's saying. It's like you don't have a philosophy that allows you to give this ethical instruction to people, even though you still have to figure out some way to do it. You just have to say, well, it can't be part of my philosophy. It has to just be in some student's way of looking at things. So on the other hand, you can go the other direction and say, oh yeah, we really have to have this ethics. Then you have a reified idea of things having some intrinsic nature that can be the foundation of those ethical distinctions. But then you have the problem of what are we going to do with all the sutras where Buddha's saying that things lack intrinsic nature. Well, we'll just, make those interpretable and have to find some other, when he said things lacked intrinsic nature, he was just getting warmed up to tell us that they really do in a way or something. I don't know exactly how the line works there, but that's the idea. You're going to have an exegetical problem. So this is what he says. Like when you think about it, it's very difficult. It's not, we just know emptiness, dependent arising, emptiness. Nagarjuna said it, Tsongkhapa said it, so emptiness, dependent arising. Like it's just like, oh, it's obvious, It's not obvious. That's not what he said. There's the whole point of it is like, well, this was really difficult for people. I think we were saying, most Buddhists disagreed with this historically. They didn't think that this was right, It seemed, either they thought it was nihilistic system to say that there was emptiness because it was going to destroy the Four Noble Truths because you didn't have anything that was real that could be the basis of anything else. Or they said, oh yeah, Nagarjuna had this profound, vision of emptiness, and we'll do like a kind of an as-if way of bracketing, our ethics and side of the path. I was thinking about what happens with these people if ethics is not really an active wing of the bird, but just as kind of a concession, a training, concession. It's not like, love and compassion aren't founded on any conventional existence of persons and their misery and their happiness potential and so forth, but it's just like a concession to fools. Then what happens if that's in the practice then is deeper and deeper realization of an emptiness that cancels out all conventional existence and clears your eyes of the delusion that causes you to see anything as existing. Then what happens when you're completely enlightened? and so people have different kinds of. These are real Tibetans from before Tsongkhapa, and some of them seem to have an idea of a Buddha who realizes something that's utterly inconceivable and indescribable. First of all, you can't even really say what it is, and having realized this utterly and inconceivable and undescribable absolute. Doesn't have any field of awareness that we can conceive of or imagine. But that doesn't mean that there isn't, there could be some appearance of compassionate activity that goes on, but there isn't any awareness of any conventional reality whatsoever. So some of us who are not true believers in that conception have called that the robo-Buddha model, that Buddha can't be really aware of people, can't really be aware of their suffering, can't really be in any way cognizant, even in a spontaneous, direct way. The mental landscape of an enlightened being has to exclude all of us. But then if there's going to be any compassionate activity going on, it has to be without awareness, without any kind of awareness whatsoever. Because to be aware of that compassionate activity would be to, be in the realm of duality. Yeah. So anyway, so this was like, my point is, this isn't obvious. We just we chant it, but the whole Tsongkhapa says, this is very hard to understand. This is actually what he says. This is a little bit discouraging, but he says, since certainty about appearances, how they exist, how things dependent arising works, and certainty about emptiness, how things are utterly devoid of any shred of intrinsic nature, they almost never develop together. That's what it says on page 138. So it's extremely difficult to find the Madhyamaka view. It's not, just like we think that would be a natural thing. You can get some people, of course the idea is the distinctive feature of Madhyamaka is to use dependent arising as a reasoning to understand that things lack intrinsic nature. And things lack intrinsic nature because they are dependent arising. And in working in that way, of course, you can see that these things are connected and try to develop understanding of the two together. But I think that when you start to think about what it really means for things to be dependent arisings in the way that we were before, when you think, well, really what he means by dependent arising is that there's nothing there on the object side apart from the point of view, being established from the point of view of the framework of some mind for which it's taken as existing, that there's nothing like there in it on its own side, right, that is it, then you have to wonder. In other words, do you see what I'm saying? I mean, it's like if you think, dependent arising means things arise from cause and effects, and if they were intrinsically real, then it wouldn't be like that. Then that's good. That's a good start. That's a powerful thing. What I'm just saying is that what Rinpoche is saying, well, that isn't getting to the root meaning of emptiness or dependent arising. The root meaning, as far as I'm concerned, is something that's much closer to the bone, closer to our heart, and harder to eliminate. And so you don't, and that's why. And he, not saying that I know what Buddha was thinking under the tree, but going by what Nagarjuna says, the mind of the sage, reflecting on this, turned away from giving his teaching. And also in Precious Garland, that's in the treatise on the way. And in Precious Garland, Nagarjuna says, realizing because of his profundity how difficult this was going to be for us to understand, the sage, when he became a Buddha, turned away from giving his teaching. So that's the basis of the story that, whether we credit it or not, that the Buddha had hesitation about being able to communicate what he's understood, because it wasn't just like self-evident in the way that we sometimes take it. So thus, he said, the treatises and the scriptures state that it is very difficult to understand this profound view. He also gives us advice, along with the discouragement of how difficult this is. What's going to help? Well, you should start by upholding your ethical commitments. Then strive in many ways to accumulate collections of merit and wisdom, and clear away your obscurations, and rely upon learned teachers, and make efforts to study, and reflect on the instructions of your teachers. That's his advice. It's kind of this is one of the things that's amazing about this book, because it's so erudite. Well, and it's kind of like the way His Holiness teaches, because he's saying, you should try to be more kind and think about things. And as Arya Deva said in verse 138 of his 400 stanzas, and then and then he's saying, Well, and then he goes back and forth between these kinds, and this is what Tsongkhapa is like. You should take all of this as very personal advice for your practice, and that's what he actually tells you in the beginning. And it's so funny. It's like throughout the book, he maintains this tone that he's like just talking to you and giving you personal instructions. But that he gets into these incredibly complicated arguments about the 4 wrong interpretations of the distinction between Svatantrika and Prasangika. And it's like, oh, well, I'll take this to heart for my practice sometime. But yeah, he does keep coming back to this, personal voice that he's giving you instruction, and then sometimes he puts little poems in where he calls us friends. Friends, if you know what's good for you, and gives us a little advice like that. He gives this example of saying, like, if you don't understand how dependent arising and emptiness are the same thing, and you're just meditating on emptiness, and you use all these reasonings, and you're looking at a pot. You have your pot as the object now, so you realize that the pot isn't one with its parts, and not different from its parts, and you see that like the pot is kind of like vanishing, right? And like before your analytical mind, and then you think, gosh, all those reasons that cause the pot to go away, they all apply to me as the analyzer too. And then, like, if I don't exist, then who's doing the analysis? And then he said, well, at that point, people just go, I guess Buddha taught that things neither exist nor doesn't exist. There's no position that one can hold. There's nothing you can say in the face of emptiness, and that's it, right? He said, well, that's a mistake. They haven't really understood that by using the non-finding of the pot under analysis hasn't destroyed the pot, hasn't made the pot non-existent. They are the analyzer. The pot is the analyzed thing, and they're perhaps in this case unsuccessfully looking for the actual meaning of the pot's final nature, right? And if they find that nature, then they should be able to understand that that's not something that destroys or eliminates the pot. It just means that the pot doesn't exist in such a way as to be found when you search for its ultimate nature, as I talked about the other day. Okay. So, intelligent people should therefore develop an unshakable certainty that the very meaning of emptiness is dependent arising. And that's part of my point is here. It's like I don't want to in any way diminish the centrality of that point to his teaching. I just want you to see that he's not saying, he phrases it so he's not saying, and these two therefore are exactly the same thing, and that seeing one or knowing one with your mind is in that same instant a case of understanding the other one completely. Part of the idea actually of being able to use dependent arising as a reason for realizing emptiness is the idea that we can meditate on dependent arising now, and that will help us to realize emptiness. The other point that's lurking here, and that I alluded to the other day with just this brief phrase, is that with this last sentence he says, when you do all these reasonings, Blaya, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Buddhapalija, Chandrakirti, give the full commentary on what you should do, you'll realize that meditating on dependent arising will give you certain knowledge of the absence of intrinsic existence. So that's an absence or a lack of intrinsic existence. And that's what the whole tradition takes as the meaning of emptiness. A sheer lack of any intrinsic nature in anything. So with regard to any object that you point to or anything, person that you point to. The sheer lack or absence of that. So without, and this is what it was like, without at that moment, in that time, implying in its place some other affirmative phenomenon. That's the tradition. So that's called a non-affirming negative. It's the sheer or mere or utter absence of any intrinsic nature. Now, so that isn't literally dependent arising. When you're realizing that, you're realizing something that you could say cashes out as dependent arising once you see that phenomena appear, right? But dependent arising and its meaning doesn't appear to your mind when you're directly realizing emptiness at that exact same time, right? So if you think of it, like, who is the person who comes to this conclusion and says the very meaning of emptiness is the very meaning of dependence, and who really, really knows that with certainty and can form this idea and explain it is a person in what we were talking is like who has realized emptiness and then emerged from emptiness. Person who's come back to channel A having been to channel B and is saying, yeah, I can see how all these things that people are talking about are appearances and that they exist and they matter, but they don't exist at all in the way people think. It's not at all like how people are assuming or talking about, and they're fighting with each other, you know, like just the talking heads on the television completely unnecessarily because they have these distorted ideas, right, about you know, about how things really exist. So it's like the aftermath wisdom, right? It's like after the point of view that you could have that kind of conversation. Anyway, I thought I would say that because this whole idea about the ultimate being a non-affirming negative gets to be quite a problematic thing because, well, not because of anything I've just said, really. Gelugpa's, you know, get in line, but as we know, but it's because like other sects of Tibetan Buddhism don't like it, generally speaking. I mean, there may be differences. There's some that may like it more than others, but there's a lot of discomfort with that idea, and there's a tendency to think that there has to be some sort of something like a pure Buddha mind, or that's like an absolute or an ultimate that's like that's revealed by the stripping away of this false superimposition of intrinsic nature, and that when you realize emptiness, you're letting your light shine in a way that, you know, it hasn't shined before. And then there comes a problem with like, well, is that really the same as emptiness as a non-affirming negative? And then this causes a lot of misunderstanding between different groups of Tibetans, and which is relevant to us, even though, you know, we're not Tibetan, because those disagreements ramify down to the different groups of people who are practicing Tibetan Buddhism beyond Tibet. Yeah. Okay. All right, so that was that. And then the other thing I wanted to say something about was this idea of things being conceptual imputations. If you, we did the example of the fantastic thing, you know, that J. Rinpoche does in the Great Exposition, where he says, you know, somebody sees the rope, they think it's a snake. But let's set all that aside, how the snake appears from their point of view, and just ask about what the snake's like in itself. Now that was in, you know, 1401, the great treatise on the stage of the path. But then, you know, some years later, toward the end of his life, and he was like, I don't know the exact year, but, you know, like 1417 or something in there, he came back, you know, 15 years or more later, he came back to write the medium-length exposition of the stages of the path. And it's not, as you would think, just kind of a shortened version of the long one. It's a different book. And it has a lot of, it's organized a little differently and has different things in it, and it leaves out, you know, some of the stuff that was very difficult to get through in the long one. And it has new Shastra quotes that weren't in the other one and so forth, so it's very interesting. And when he comes to present within this what Prasangika says about the misconception that's the root of cyclic existence, he gets right to the point. There's no beating around the bush and preliminaries. He says, in this system, phenomena are assigned as merely posited through the force of conceptuality. That's the first thing he says. He doesn't start with a discussion about impermanence or causes or parts and wholes. He just says that's on page 201 in Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Final Exposition of Wisdom. In this system, phenomena are assigned as merely posited through the force of conceptuality. And then he quotes Sutra, and then he quotes Shastra. And the Sutra quote is, from the Pali Sutra, about how all these amazing flowers and these beautiful golden houses have no inherent maker or creator, and they're posited by the power of conceptuality, and by the power of conceptuality the whole world is imputed. Okay, so that seems like a useful, relevant, sutra quote. And then he gets to Nagarjuna's 60 stanzas on reasoning, and this is going to be used as his his first Shastra quote, and it has an interesting problem, I think. He says, the perfect Buddha stated that the world has the condition of ignorance. This is Nagarjuna in 60 stanzas. The perfect Buddha stated that the world has the condition of ignorance. Therefore, how could it not be feasible that this world is imputed by conceptuality? So now you know what the problem is there is Nagarjuna seems to be identifying conceptuality with ignorance, and ignorance being the root of cyclic existence, and saying we have all these gross dualistic thoughts, and that's the root of cyclic existence. Obviously, Tsongkhapa is not going to take it that way, but you can see why some people would think that that's what he meant, right? So the meaning of this statement is then, according to Tsongkhapa, explained in Chandrakirti, is that the worlds, that is all of us and our environment, are imputed by conceptuality and not established by way of their own nature. And this is a common thing, he doesn't he just says, well, this is clearly what it means to me. And if you thought that he was saying ignorance and conceptuality were exactly the same thing, then that's not what it means at all. So then there's this passage from Aryadeva that says, since desire and so forth do not exist without conceptuality, who but an idiot, who with intelligence would think that these things are real objects and also concept dependent. So desire, the objects of desire, all the different mental objects that we're talking about, it's clear that they're conceptually designated. So they're being this is equivalent to their lacking any intrinsic reality. So that's his quote that shows maybe better than the Nagarjuna quote that this is how Aryadeva understood what Nagarjuna was saying. And then the last thing from this, and then I'll go over to His Holiness. Chandrakirti makes a comment on this passage by Aryadeva, and he says, those which exist only when conceptuality exists and do not exist when conceptuality does not are without question definitely not established by way of their own nature. So something that exists when conceptuality exists and doesn't exist when conceptuality doesn't exist. Now, when I read that over and over again, I was thinking about our discussion about, a tree in the forest, and like something sprouts in the forest when no one's observing. And I say, well, when? Of course, when could also be if in either the Sanskrit or the Sanskrit grammar. And it could, I'm taking it, there's a logical sense of when as well as a temporal sense of when. And, I'm taking it as saying that, as meaning that because this is a way, I'm understanding this idea of conceptual imputation, is that it doesn't mean that when doesn't mean at each and every time that an object exists, then there must be a mind at that time that is saying, oh, there is that object. Okay? But rather, anything that exists, if there's something that exists, it has to exist in a way that's contingent upon mental imputation. And if something doesn't in some way depend on mental imputation, then we can't say that thing exists. almost seems self-evident in a sense, because how could you say that things exist if there wasn't some mind talking about that thing? Yeah. So, the reason I picked that out is because that's the context for a very powerful experience that a lot of you already know about, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama tells about in this book, How to See Yourself As You Really Are. And I gather when Jeffrey was here, he talked about this in quite a bit of detail, since he did this book and talked to His Holiness about the experience, and knows more about it than what's actually in the book. But gosh, this passage has really jumped out at me, and it's very relevant to us because it's exactly about this thing about the snake and this idea of what it means for things to be mentally imputed. This is what struck a profound chord for His Holiness in his own practice. When I was 35 years old, I was reflecting on the meaning of a passage by Tsongkhapa, and that passage is the one that immediately follows just where I stopped reading in the Medium Exposition. I was reflecting on the meaning of a passage by Tsongkhapa about how the I cannot be found either within or separate from the mind-body complex, and how the I depends for its existence on conceptuality. The passage is, "A coiled rope's speckled color and coiled form are similar to those of a snake, and when the rope is perceived in a dim area, the thought arises, there is a snake. As for the rope, at that time, when it is seen to be a snake, the collection and the parts of the rope are not even in the slightest way a snake. Therefore, that snake is merely set up by conceptuality." So now, in the other one, he set that up, and then he said, but suppose we leave aside the perspective of the concept. And then in this one, 15 years later, he does something different. He says, "Now, in the same way, when the thought I arises in dependence upon mind and body, there is nothing within the mind or body, not the collection that's a continuum of earlier and later moments, not the collection of parts that exist at any one time, not the separate parts, not the continuum of any of these individual separate parts, like the continuum of the mind. None of these things is in even the slightest way the I." Now, just to bracket here, I'm in the middle of Tsongkhapa, but that is a unique assertion of the Prasangika school, that there is nothing even conventionally among or in or around the bases of designation that you can say that is the thing. There's not even any. You can't say that the collection of the parts collection of the parts of the chariot is the chariot. You can't say that the continuum of the mind is the person, and so forth like that. Also, there is not even the slightest something that is a different entity from the mind and body that is apprehendable as an I. Consequently, without anything there on the object side, just like there's nothing there that's snake-like on the side of the rope, consequently, the I is merely set up by conceptuality, in dependence on mind and body. That's the basis of imputation. And it's not established by way of its own entity. End of quote. "Suddenly," says His Holiness, "it was as if lightning had moved through my chest. I was so awestruck that for the next few weeks, whenever I saw people, they seemed like a magician's illusion, in that they appeared to inherently exist, but at the same time I knew vividly that they actually did not. And this is when I began to understand that it really is possible to stop the process of creating destructive emotions by no longer assenting to the false way in which I and other phenomena appear to exist. Every morning I meditate on emptiness, and I recall this experience at that time in order to bring it into my day's activities. Just thinking or saying I, as in I will do such and such, will often trigger that feeling again." Wow, isn't that something? It's like every time you're saying I, you're remembering that experience when the I completely disappeared. And I started on 186 and read to 187. Yeah. Okay, so now that's what His Holiness tells about his personal experience in writing. I guess he's told more about that. There are people who know more about that story. There's a lot more to the story, but it's not all in the book. But what does he go? He goes on to, after that, he goes on to quote some of the stuff through the Upali Sutra, the exact same thing from Aryadeva that we just read. He quotes the Sutra and Shastra stuff that we just finished discussing, sort of back up this experience. And then he comes to sort of where we were, and that is like, well, what does this mean? How are we to understand, this is page 189, how are we to understand the insistence of the great Indians and Tibetans on how crucial conceptual thought is? And then this is the sentence I've underlined here. It would be most uncomfortable to hold that before each and every object comes into our ken. We must have a thought constructing it right at that moment. So if we have some qualms about that, then that seems like that's not what how His Holiness is going to interpret that experience. He said, no matter how fast our thoughts are operating, there wouldn't be enough time for all the thoughts that would be needed in a single moment of visual perception to deposit all the objects that were being perceived by all the different beings. Right? And then second point. So that's point number one, why he doesn't think this experience of things being conceptual imputations means that there's a thought that exists at each moment before each object, setting it up one by one. The second reason is that prasangikas assert external objects. And that's what he says. Indeed, external objects are part of the process of generating consciousness of them. So this is like interesting. I thought you just said there wasn't anything on the object side. Well, there's a basis of imputation. This is when, like, Venerable Churchon was asking the question about, yeah, but what's the basis? What's the thing that the conventional consciousness is connecting with when it's seeing the table? Is the table? Or you say, you have a table and it exists, in an interdependent way with the conventional conscious ascertaining the table. They don't exist like separately in and of themselves. And in this case, he's saying, well, it's not a mind-only system. It's not an idealist system. It's not saying that everything is of one nature of the mind. This is, just to recall, I'm not claiming that I understand all the answers to this. But since, prasangikas assert an external world, and that means that they assert matter. They assert matter. So, what's this matter made out of? Well, it's made out of bits, and you can call them atoms. But, of course, you can't ever find, the essential or irreducible bit, of course. But, at the same time, there is matter. And so then the question is like, I asked my teacher, Geshe Takpa in India, to say, well, if there's matter, and there's external objects, and you can say these external objects, and that there's matter there, then wouldn't you say that like the table's made out of matter? I said this to Venerable Children. I said, well, can't you say that the table's atomically constituted? Could you say? Well, I asked Geshe Takpa this, and when we say in Tibetan, dulda truba, couldn't you say this is like made out of atoms or established atomically? That would be a literal translation. Can you say that the table is established atomically? He's like, very worried, concerned. No, you couldn't say that. I don't think so. You can't say that it's atomically established. You say there's atoms there, but if you say the table is atomically established, then you say that it gains its entity by way of having a nature that's founded on atomic construction. Well, how does it gain its entity? Merely as an imputation in relationship to a base of imputation within which you cannot find any table whatsoever.